teacher, theologian, writer, who said, God made human beings because God loves stories. Or you think of the Native American writer Thomas King, who wrote a book called The Truth About Stories. And he said the truth about stories is that's all we are. We're a story. And if you were able to go to the center of the world, what you would find there is not molten lava. You would find a story in his tradition, right? Or I think of the story of when Jesus is telling parables, and Anthony DeMello has this translation where the disciples ask Jesus, why do you speak in stories? And in his translation, Jesus replies, well, don't you know that the shortest distance between a human being and the truth is a story? And we know this. There's something in our minds, our brains. We're wired for story. And I think of when I was here in my 20s, beginning my sort of spiritual journey and spiritual awakening, and we would do practices, silence and contemplation and solitude and all meditations, all these different things. And you would be trying to dive down and locate yourself and understand the complexity of what's going on inside yourself. But then we'd come out and we'd sit in circles and we'd tell the story. I started to fall asleep, and then I woke up, and as soon as I woke up, I remembered being 4 years old on this beach in Southern California, and I remembered I think it was the first time I watched a sunset, and the rest of the group is there listening. We're following the bread trails. We're following the images and sensations, and we're seeking to leave our little world. Right? All of us have our own little world. To leave our little world, and in the listening to the other story, we're seeking to cross through space and time and sit with that person who's talking about being 4 years old on the beach watching their first sunset. And we're suddenly, through the story, transported and with them. And a connection is made. And we feel seen and heard, and parts of our own life gets brought to the surface. So we know this power of story. Everybody does. Because if you were lucky when you were little, right? If you were lucky when you were little, you might have had someone who told you stories. That grandmother or that aunt or the good babysitter who would come over and they'd bring a book out. Or better yet, they'd make it up, right? Bedtime would come, and in that sort of twilight of the low lights, and you laying there getting ready to move into sleep, and they would say, have you ever heard of a place called Greenland? You'd say, no. Well, once upon a time, there were people in Greenland, and they were hungry, and they had no food. So the folks in Nova Scotia, where's Nova Scotia? It's far away from Greenland, up in Canada. And there was a ship, and they loaded it full of food, and they were going to take it to the starving people of Greenland, but the captain got drunk, and the crew ran away. And it was just you and me there. Us? Yes. And we had to unhook the boat and get behind the wheel and steer it out into the ocean. And we were going to bring the food to the people in Greenland. And they're making up this story right there. And you can see it. You see yourself and the babysitter behind the wheel, driving the ship, the fog coming out on the water, the strange sound off in the fog. Ooh. We didn't know if it was a monster or a lighthouse. Why didn't we turn back? Because we had to help the people. And so we steered the boat, right? And you smell the seawater, and all of that space starts to kind of come into the room. And you leave your body, and you leave that bedroom, and you're in another world that you and your babysitter or you and your grandmother are creating. Remember that time. Or you'd have that good teacher who would say, okay, if everyone helps me clean up the classroom, I'll read 2 chapters from the book. Yes. And then you'd look at Troy and say, don't screw this up, Troy. Help us clean the room, right? And then everybody would clean up, and then you'd all get on the floor, and the teacher would bring out the book, and they'd start telling the story. And you'd feel this sense of relief. Like suddenly all the tensions in the classroom, or all the pain in your family back home, or all the awkwardness that you were experiencing would fall away, and you would leave your body and leave time and space, and suddenly you and the other 25 classmates and the teacher would be in the north of England, in the old mansion, with the Pevensey children, and the uncle's coming upstairs, and you run into the wardrobe, and you're hiding in there among the jackets, and there's a little light in the back of the wardrobe, and falling snow, and all of you start to move out there, right? And it's not just you who've left your body in time and space. You're in the wardrobe with all your classmates too, and you're all experiencing this world together. And there's this connection and this sense of relief that we don't have to be in our other lives right now. We get to be these brave, creative children in another time and another space. We know this pleasure, right, of story. So when my daughter was 3 years old, she refused to wear clothes. She just completely refused to wear clothes. And any of you parents know this kind of feud that kind of emerges, where we were trying every kind of clothes that might work with her, right? Didn't matter. It was too slippery. I don't like how it feels on my shoulder. It's bumpy. It's rough. It's too tight, and then whoosh, off go the clothes. So we live in Ashland, Oregon, by the foothills of the Siskiyou Mountains, and also where the Cascades kind of creep up through the state. It gets cold, gets dark in the winter, and we couldn't go outside. We couldn't go out for pizza. We couldn't leave the house because we would have this naked little child, and it's cold outside. And in Ashland, someone was going to call Child Protection Services if they saw us out there with this little girl. So we're stuck, and we're homebound. And it's getting dark, and particularly in January, it's a very dark month. It's cold, and we're stir crazy. And one day, one night, my wife says, "We are going out for pizza tonight. I'm getting the boys." My daughter had 2 older brothers. "I'm getting them in the van, and we will wait. You get Grace dressed and meet us in the van." And of course, little naked Grace is watching this interaction, going, "Oh, we'll see how this goes," right? And so I say, "Come on, Grace, let's go up to your room." So we get in her room, which was upstairs, and I'm looking for these little kind of velvety shirt and pants that sometimes she would leave on, and I'm putting them on, and as soon as I get the clothes on her, she goes, "It's too loose, it's too loose," and she throws the stuff off. And I go into story brain. So I run to the window, and I say, "Grace, you can't say too loose." "Why?" I said, "Well, come over here." "Where?" "Come over here by the window. Do you see up there, just where the houses stop, and you see where the trees are up there?" "Yeah." "Well, Grace, up there, that's the fawn village. And in the fawn village, the youngest fawn, his name is Toulouse. And if you yell Toulouse, he'll hear you, and he'll start to come down. They have big ears, and they can hear all through the town. And he'll hear you. I want him to come down." "No, we don't want him to come down. Because if he starts to come down here, you know how people are. They'll grab him, and they'll lock him in their house. They want to show him off to other people, so he won't be safe." And as I'm talking, right, I'm putting on pants, I'm putting on shirt, I'm picking her up. Now, Toulouse didn't like playing with the other young fawns. He liked the oldest fawn, and his name was Styx. And I'm telling the story. And as long as I talked, and as long as I stayed in that story world, she left her body and left time and space, and she was in the story world. And we could have pizza out, right? I just had to keep talking the whole time. I should say everybody else had pizza. I didn't have any that time. Well, we get home, and this becomes the beginning of the Toulouse, the fawn stories. Because every night she's like, "Dad, tell me another story about the fawn village, with their furry legs and, their ears and their horns and all this stuff." So I started telling the fawn stories. And, some nights I would say, "One time Toulouse wanted to make a human friend. So he was looking. He had to find another child who was honest and good and would take care of the forest. And so he looked and watched, and he would hide behind the bushes, and he saw this little girl, and he said, wow, she's a good person. Her name was Grace. And Dad, what? That's my name. Weird. You're right. It is the same name as you. Anyways, she was 3 years old, and Dad, I'm 3. Strange. And so this Grace and Toulouse would have these adventures and these stories, right? Well, 3 or 4 months go by. Grace says to me, Dad, today's your day off, right? Yes. Can we go up into the mountains to the fawn village? And I say, yeah, sure, okay. So we get the backpack and pack the lunches in the water, and we drive up. We're kind of live by the Pacific Crest Trail, and it's up above our home, and so we park in the lower area, and we walk up into the hills, and we're looking around for the fawn village. And in the mountains above us, there's ponderosa pines and these giant cedars, and there's also great big boulders that are kind of scattered in the woods. Granite boulders that you'll kind of see, kind of like the Oregon coast, if you've ever seen that. There's these massive rocks. And she sees a cluster of these granite boulders kind of in a circle, surrounded by trees, and she says, Dad, there it is. It's the fawn village. They make it look like rocks when people are around, but at night it becomes their homes. And so she starts walking around these giant boulders looking for signs, and she finds them, right? She finds a stick. This is one of their walking sticks, I can tell. There's manzanita trees there that have this tan bark that kind of curls and scrolls off the trunks. And she says, Dad, they use this for paper. We find a campfire that somebody has made up there, and there's Pabst Blue Ribbon cans all around it. She's like, Dad, this is what they drink. Just like you. And so she's finding these signs. And all of a sudden, just spontaneously, Grace starts calling out, Fawns, Fawns, you can come out. It's okay. It's me. It's Grace. You can come out. And she's walking around. Fawns, you can come out. It's me. It's just Grace. And she's walking around these stones, and she's calling out. And there's no movement. There's no sign. There's no sound. There's no fawns. And she's bewildered by this. So we spend the rest of the day hiking around, having a little adventures. We go home. The next weekend comes. Grace says, Dad, can we go back to the fawn village today? And I say, sure. And then she goes into her room and she brings out these little half walnut shells. She has about 8 of them, and she's put little gifts inside of them, little candies, and she's drawn tiny pictures and then made them very small and put them in these walnut shells. And she carefully puts them in her backpack, and she's sitting in the back of the van as we're driving up there just with this smile on her face. And we get up to the mountains, and she wants to go straight to the fawn village where these stones are. And she carefully places one of these gifts before every fawn home. And then she says, now we'll go away for a bit, Dad, and then we'll come back. So we go and hike, and then we come back, and the gifts are still there. And so she calls out, Fawns, Fawns, I've brought gifts for you. Fawns, you can come out. And there's no sign, there's no movement, there's no fawns. And I watch this change in her demeanor, and I start to get this very troubled feeling. Because I know that she is thinking, wait a minute, the fawns show up to those who are good and take care of the woods, and they're not coming out. And there's a judgment she's feeling. So I try to change the story. You know, sometimes fawns just decide it doesn't matter how nice or kind people are, they just don't want to be seen. They're very shy. And she says, no, Dad, that's not how it works. They do come out to those people who are good. So we're stuck in this story. More weeks go by. We're trying more attempts. They're not showing up. And about 6 months after I started all this, Grace says to me, Dad, I want to go to the fawn village one last time. But if they don't come out, I don't want to go up there anymore, and I don't want you to tell me any more stories about the fawns. So she's made elaborate gifts. She actually has me transcribe notes. She's dictating to me what she wants said. We get the notes, we get the pictures, we go up there, we leave the gifts, and she says, Dad, you need to help me call for the fawns. So I'm calling, fawns, come. Dad, don't pretend to call. You need to really call. So I'm trying to really call. Fawns, please come out. It's just Grace, Please come out. Nothing. She tells me, put me on top of this rock here. I pick her up. I place her on top of a rock because she knows another kind of magic that we all know, right? Which is song. And so when I place her on top of this rock, she climbs up there and she closes her eyes and she puts her hands on her heart and she starts to sing. Fawns, you can trust me. My name is Grace and you can trust me. She just starts to sing this little song. She's just making it up on the spot. And then after her song ends, she opens her eyes and she looks around. And there's nothing. And so I help her down and I start to try to soothe her. We don't really know what's happened. Dad, I don't want you to talk right now. So we hold hands. She's heartbroken. I'm heartbroken. This is the end of a season for us. And on that particular day, I decided to have us walk through these winding trails that take us from the hills above the town of Ashland, where we live, down into the park. We have this 2-mile park called Lithia Park, if you've ever been there. And it has ponds, and it has forested areas, and then it has different grassy meadows. And we walk in silence down the mountain trails, and we end up coming into the park, the edge of the woods, into a great grass field. And as we come to the edge of the woods, there, standing in the middle of the grass, with fur legs, matted goatee, horns coming out of the side of his head, playing a wooden flute, is a fawn. Now it was just some guy. It was just some guy dressed in fur pants who had wired deer antlers to his head. He had an oak leaf mask over his eyes, shirtless, dancing around with this flute, right? Grace says, as we're standing there, there he is. And I'm thinking, this guy's on drugs. But I have to play it out, right? I have to play it out. So we're holding hands there, and we start to walk out into the grass towards this dancing figure. And we get closer. He notices us. He stops playing flute, and he looks at us through his oak leaf mask and his deer antlers. He stares at us, and I say, Mr. Fawn, we have been looking for you for a long time. And this is my daughter, Grace, and she's a very honest person and trustworthy, and she cares about the woods, and we just really wanted to meet you. And this guy, whoever he was, steps closer, and then he kind of kneels down so that he's in eye contact with Grace, same eye level, and he says, oh, yes, I know you're an honest and good person, and I know you care about the woods, and I'd like to meet you too. And he puts out his hand, and Grace puts out her little hand, kind of shaking, and they shake hands, and I say, Grace, do you want to say anything? And she says, no. And so I say, thank you so much. He says, oh, by the way, if you ever want to see me again, I come through here once a year, and I usually sleep over there. He shows some rhododendrons with a backpack and a sleeping bag. This guy's a traveler. And we back up, and then Grace lets go of my hand, and she takes off running through the park. And she's yelling, I saw a fawn, I saw a fawn, I saw a fawn. And when I finally catch up to her, She says, Dad, now do you believe? Now do you believe? Right? So there's this power in story that goes way deeper than the rational mind. It sends us seeking into mountains. It sends us singing songs. It sends us seeking and preparing gifts to find something that the soul knows but that the mind can't comprehend. When I wrote this book that they mentioned, my board sent me on a book tour. We did 91 events in 60 cities. And I did a lot of universities and high schools. There's a lot of despair in young people right now. They're talking about not having children. We'll never have a home. We might not have a country. There's not going to be much of a future. There's this incredible lack of hope that I've just never experienced in so many people. And it's because of the stories they're hearing. They need a story. And sometimes as human beings, we need stories that tell us there are fawns. Not the way you thought they might be. Not the way you might have imagined and tried to control the story. But if you go searching, believing sometimes is seeing. That the stories can help us to say there could be peace. There could be hope. There could be a restoration of waterways and oceans. There can be healing. But we often need a story to help coax forth our capacity to trust and to build and to create. Right? We need story. And this is what all of our wisdom traditions do for us, is embedded in the stories of whatever spiritual tradition or wisdom tradition. They draw forth our imagination. And our bodies don't know the difference between what we're imagining and what we're actually seeing. Right? The images are powerful so that when you imagine something, the body reacts. Gets excited. Tears come to our eyes. Or laughter shows up through the stories we tell. So there's a power that we all know exists in stories. Outside of the Modern Museum of Art in Denver, Colorado, they put a shipping container, and that shipping container, they had a little sign, and the sign said, Empathy Museum. And if you had time, there was a curator there, and they would invite you into this shipping container. You'd come in. On 3 walls, there were these little boxes, these cubbies. And in each little box was a worn pair of shoes. Now, if you had time, they'd say, okay, find your size. And above each box, it would say women's 6 or men's 8 or whatever the different shoe sizes. You would find pairs of shoes that would fit you. You'd choose a worn pair of shoes. You'd put them on. They'd walk you outside the box. And then the curator would say, okay, look on the ground there. And there would be these red arrows that were drawn in chalk on the sidewalk. And the curator would say, you're invited to walk 1 mile following these arrows in someone else's shoes. And then they'd give you a pair of headphones. And in the headphones, it would be the person who owned those shoes telling you their life story. As you walked, it'd be a Syrian refugee. It'd be a single mom who's working 2 jobs to raise 3 kids. It'd be a cancer survivor or someone who survived the Iraq War. And they'd be telling you their story as you're wearing their very shoes, walking this mile. And when you did that walk, that same childhood power would come over you. And you'd leave your body, and you'd leave time and space, and you would sit in the life of another human being, walking with them through the bread trail of what they have lived and suffered and overcome. Right? And when you came back, the curator told me, we would give people a 3x5 card. Would you like to write a note to the person whose shoes you've been wearing? And they said the problem was people would say, can I get about 10 of those? Because what I need to tell them is, I had such a prejudice against people in your situation, but I'd never heard the story. And now that I've heard it, I could see myself in that story. Or they might say, I had a similar experience. I can't believe how close my life has been to yours. Can I please tell you what I've been through? This power we have. So I work with an organization that was mentioned, the Hearth, where we use personal stories, testimony, or maybe it's more like confession, where people tell stories in order to create connection in times or in places that are disconnected. So that might be, well, I just finished a project on the Oregon coast where we were working in school districts that have become incredibly contentious. We have people showing up to school board meetings and to town hall meetings who want books removed from the school and or certain things not taught or certain teachers sanctioned, and then you have other people who are very vocal in support of those books or those teachers and things, and they're coming to meetings, right? And we use story as a way to help people feel and hear and see one another so that we have the relational context to then take on some of the problems that face us. Well, in 2017, I was invited to live in Austin, Texas. So my wife and daughter, we moved there for 6 months, and to hold story events in the city around different topics that young adults were interested in. 2017, if you remember, Donald Trump had just been elected president, and there was a lot of very harsh language about immigrants and undocumented people. Well, Austin has hundreds of thousands of undocumented people who are neighbors and business leaders and community leaders and parents in the schools. They're all over the place in Austin. And they were frightened. So we did a story event in the Mexican American Cultural Center, which is right downtown Austin. And we called it Breaking Down Walls. And we had 6 dreamers, if you know this term. These are people who were brought into the country as infants and then have grown up here their whole life. So they were all in their 20s, and they were going to tell their story of what it's like to be undocumented. National Public Radio sent correspondents. USA Today had someone there. There were photographers. It was a hot topic, so these storytellers were going to be giving voice to their experience. And I remember one of the first storytellers was a guy named Christian Mendoza. And Christian started his story. This is in this center. There's about 400 people. They're sitting on the floor. They're sitting up on the stage. It was the largest event they'd ever had there. And he stands up to tell his story. He's about 28 years old. And he said, you know, when I was a child, I wanted to become a policeman. That was my dream. I wanted to become a policeman. And he said the reason was this was my dad's dream when he was a child. He said, my parents grew up in Juarez, and my dad and his best friend were so angry and upset at the injustices and the violence happening around them in their neighborhoods that my dad and his best friend decided when we get older, we're going to work in law enforcement and we're going to make the neighborhood safe. This dream. And we would play out and act out all the things we were going to do. Sure enough, we grew up, we became policemen, and then we became what we would call detectives, and they started to have some success. And Christian said, I grew up hearing these stories. And then one night, there was a knock on the door. It was his dad's best friend's wife, and she said, they found my husband's body. He was tortured and murdered, and you guys need to run. And so my parents, without taking anything with them, fled. And they came across the border into the United States. And my dad's dream of working in law enforcement died. He couldn't do that work anymore when he came to the States. But he told me the stories. And it planted in me this dream. So that when I was in high school, I saw a sign that the police department was inviting people to become interns. You could become an intern, a student intern in training with the police department. So he said, I signed up, I got in, and I remember after I went through my training, we had this big event. If you know Austin, the bookstore there that's very popular is called Book People. And he said President Clinton was coming to Book People. And I was on the security detail with the police. And my job is I was the one who watched the front door. And when the president showed up, I made sure no one else came in, the former president. I made sure no one came in except for President Clinton and his entourage and whoever had the official tags. So there I am standing there, limousine pulls up, people are corded off, and out of the limousine comes former President Clinton, and he's got an assistant with him. They're walking down the aisle, people are asking for autographs, and they want selfies and pictures, and I'm standing by the door, and eventually they make it up. And the assistant says to me, would you like, young man, would you like a photograph? And I said, yes. And so I handed him my phone, and I stood next to the former president, and they took a picture. And then I opened the doors, and I did my duty. And when the event ended, I went home, and I printed off the picture. I went to school, the high school, the next morning. I brought it with me, and I said, hey, anybody want to see a picture with me and President Clinton? He said, okay. And so the students gather around, and he said, I showed it to them, and they said, that's Matthew McConaughey. That's not Bill Clinton. He said, turned out I didn't know who President Clinton was or what he looked like. That was way before my time. I also didn't know who Matthew McConaughey was. It turns out it was the movie star and President Clinton were walking up together, and everybody wanted a picture and an autograph from the movie star, from Matthew McConaughey, so I assumed he was the president. He said it was President Clinton who actually said to me, do you want a picture, young man? Assuming I wanted a picture with the movie star. He's the one who took my phone and took the picture. He said 2 years later, President Obama, who was president at the time, came to Austin, was coming to the same, I was on detail this time. I was watching in charge of the cars. So I stood in the back, and there was 4 or 5 of us guarding the cars. The event happens, the event ends. President Obama and his entourage are with him. They're coming back to the vehicles. And he said it was actually President Obama, and I knew what he looked like, who made eye contact with me and said, young man, would you like a picture? And I said, yes. And so President Obama came over and stood with me, and I handed my phone to somebody in his entourage, and they took the photo. Right? A couple months after that, I had applied to a criminal justice program at a state school in Texas, and I got in, and it was summertime, and I was called in by the financial aid office. And they said, we have been running your social security number over and over again. It doesn't match. Did we get something wrong here? I looked at it. No, that's my number. Well, it doesn't match you. I was bewildered. I went home and I told my parents, they're saying my social security number doesn't work, which means I can't get the financial aid, which means I can't go to school. And he said my parents just turned white, and then they just kind of fell apart. And then they told me the story. You were born in Mexico. And when we fled, we brought you with us. You were just a baby. And we paid someone for that social security number, hoping that no one would know that you weren't a citizen of this country. So as soon as I found out that story, I told the school, I'm not a citizen here. I don't have a social security number, which meant I couldn't go to school. And because I wasn't a citizen, I can't work for the city police, the county police. I couldn't work for any federal law enforcement agencies. And so that dream that I had been carrying died. And then he ended his story with this. He said, so I want to leave you with this statement. You trust me to guard 2 presidents, but you don't trust me to vote. Now, there were 5 other people who told stories at that event that we organized. The event ends, and a woman dressed in a very sharp red business suit, she's about 40 years old, brass blonde hair, these blue tinted glasses. She had all this camera equipment, and she had come up to me before the event. She said, I'm a freelance photographer. I'm here for a number of newspapers taking pictures. I'll be here for about 15 minutes moving around the room, taking photographs, and then I'll be out of your hair. I just wanted you to know what I'm doing and who I am. Well, the event ends, and I see her standing against the wall until everybody leaves and we're cleaning up, and she walks up and she said, I want to talk to you. And I said, yeah. She goes, I have been living in a bubble. She said, I'm for the wall. I'm for get the immigrants out of this country, all that stuff. But I've never heard the stories. She said, would you help me meet Christian Mendoza? I have friends who are lawyers. I want to help that young man get his dream back. Now, if we had had a night saying, let's talk about immigration, right? We all would show up, and I have my arguments ready, and you have your arguments ready, and I know how I'm going to counter your arguments, and on we go, and nothing changes. But when you move into story, you move beneath right and wrong, true and false. You move into the language of human experience. And when we allow ourselves to listen and hear and be moved by the experiences of others, things shift. Our minds shift. We have new data points to live with. And we can begin to feel the humanity of one another. Story is that language of human experience. Every time we tell a story, we're saying, this is what it feels like to be me. Right? This is what it feels like to be me. And this is why it's so powerful as a folk medicine and as a healing modality, because anybody can tell stories, and everybody knows how to listen to stories in a way that can create the connections that we need to heal as individuals and as communities. So this is this power. Now, I've been talking for a while here, and what I've learned is the best way for us to investigate and explore and learn how this power functions in us is to actually tell stories. So here's what we're going to do. It's very tricky because I feel like we might need a break, but I need some people to lock the doors so no one can leave the building during this break. But let me just give you a little preview, okay? So we'll take a little 5-minute break, and then we're going to share some stories together. As was communicated, yes, by Cynthia, you're not going to be sharing things that you don't want to share. It's little memories that I'm going to have you share in small groups in ways that you can listen and hear, and I promise you're probably going to have an experience of delight in getting to recall little things from your life. And they're just short little vignettes that you'll tell for 2 minutes, 3 minutes in small groups. But I want us to explore this needed medicine in this time we're in, that your kids, your grandkids, your neighbors, your friends, we need to move into this way of interacting if we're going to get where we're all longing to go. Okay? So will you, everybody solemnly swear you'll come back? Okay, well, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back, and then we'll do some of these exercises together. Okay.